On October 2nd, 1977 at Dodger Stadium, a rookie named Glenn Burke threw up his hands over his head to celebrate a home run, and the man rounding third reached up and slapped it. That was the first high five in the history of sports. Nobody planned it, nobody had a name for it, and the man who hit that home run was Dusty Baker. Baker tells that story and about 50 years of others in his new book, Crossroads, a memoir in baseball and life, with Steve Kedmond. And here's what makes it worth reading. Almost no one has stood at more of baseball's turning points more than Dusty Baker. He was kneeling in the on-deck circle when Hank Aaron broke Babe Ruth's home run record. He won a World Series as a player and then another as a 73-year-old manager, becoming the oldest man to win that in any of the four major American sports. One life, and somehow it runs straight through a lot of the game's biggest milestones. But before he was a manager, before the World Series rings, Dusty Baker was a kid in California who never planned on playing baseball at all. He was born Johnny B. Baker Jr. in Riverside in 1949 and grew up outside Sacramento in Carmichael, where his father worked at McClellan Air Force Base. At Del Campo High, he was a four-sport athlete: baseball, football, track, and his real love, basketball. He was good enough on the court that Santa Clara offered him a scholarship. As far as his family was concerned, he was going to college. Then in 1967, the Atlanta Braves drafted him. His father dead set against it. He wanted his son in the classroom, not on a bus in minor league teams, and he told the scouts flat out that Dusty was college bound. So the Braves sent them one man who might change his mind, Hammer and Hank Aaron. Aaron came to talk to the family, and eventually Dusty and his mother signed the contract against his father's wishes. A teenager from California was headed for the deep south, and almost immediately the timing got complicated. Baker enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserves and served from 1969 to 1975 as a Lance Corporal, trained as an auto mechanic. For those early years, he was pulled between the reserves and the minor leagues, and he only played a handful of major league games. He didn't lock down an everyday big league job until 1972. But once he did, he became a star. Aaron took him under his wing in Atlanta, and after a trade to Los Angeles, Baker turned into one of the steadiest bats in the National League. Over 19 seasons with the Braves, Dodgers, Giants, and A's, he hit .278 with 242 home runs and more than 1,000 runs batted in. He was a two-time All-Star, won a Gold Glove, took home a couple Silver Sluggers, and was named the 1977 NLCS MVP, and won a World Series ring with the Dodgers in 1981. And here's the number that says the most about him. He finished with 1,981 hits, 19 short of the round 2,000 nearly every player chases. He never seemed to care much about the milestone, he cared about the teams. And that's just his playing career. Baker went on to manage for another quarter century across 5 franchises: the Giants, Cubs, Reds, Nationals, and Astros. He won more than 2,000 games, 7th most of any manager who lived, but for decades the one thing that escaped him was a championship, in an era when very few black men were ever handed a team to run in all. He finally broke through in 2022, winning the World Series with the Houston at 73 years old. That's the arc of the book Crossroads, the kid who came from nothing, playing basketball, and eventually was able to break into baseball in a sport that's kind of widely known for breaking the color barrier with Jackie Robinson. But like a lot of things in America and frankly worldwide, just because something like that happens, it's not a one-time event, it's a process. And so Dusty talks a lot in this book about being a black man in America, particularly a black man playing sports, playing baseball, playing in the Deep South. I'm a huge baseball fan, so I of course knew who Dusty Baker was, the manager, but it really does feel like this guy has lived so many different lives because he's been around the game so long. I had no idea that he served in the military. I always thought that he was like an okay baseball player, and I guess you could kind of argue that he was, but he was a pretty good ball player, and you find out about that in his book as well. So this is his new book. It runs through over 50 years of baseball. Really cool story when you get into it. There's a lot of, one of the things that I found interesting early on reading the book is how often he kind of like rubbed shoulders with people. Like before he was even big into baseball, he knew the Bondses. So Bobby Bonds, which Barry Bonds' dad, was someone who they knew in different circles of their life. And there were several other people where that happened along the way, whether it was baseball or football. And this is all prior to him being anybody in sports. And it just kind of reminded me of how sports in America used to be. before it was such big business. Like a lot of these guys, Dusty included, they had to work off-season jobs. Dusty sold cars for one summer. And players today obviously would never even come close to having to do that, nor would they do that. But back then, when you played sports, you weren't an icon. You weren't totally absolved and above society. And you just met other players, and they became more of mentors and more heroes to players. And that was just something that stood out to me with this book. I don't even think he meant that, Dusty, I don't even think he meant that as like a big part of it, but it just, I don't know, as someone who grew up in the 80s, I just remember earlier times of sports where these guys were truly heroes and role models, and where today it just feels like they're on a distant land and live in a world that we could never touch. So that was something that jumped out at me. Throughout his playing career, he goes through in pretty good detail, especially his playing career with the Braves and with Hank Aaron. He's obviously very influenced by Hank Aaron. It goes into a lot of the stories about what Hank dealt with, being a black guy in the Deep South, breaking Babe Ruth's record. So that part was cool to learn. In a lot of ways, it was like a history book in that sense. And then, of course, he goes into his coaching career, which is more of where I knew him as a baseball coach. And, really cool to see him. He eventually wins a World Series with the Astros, which was also an interesting one in that he took over the Astros team that was famous for stealing signals and doing the whole trash can banging thing, and ended up winning a World Series with them. I think in 4 years, they went to 2 World Series and were an out away from going to 2 more. So crazy 4-year run that he eventually has with the Astros. Just a quick couple things on the book itself. So it's a pretty dense book. It's about 400 pages. And I would say if you're not a baseball fan, it's going to be a difficult read because it's a blow by blow, especially of his early playing career. I mean, he's going really in deep into games. He spends a lot more on his playing career than his managing career. And even at the very end, it's only like 20 or 30 pages on the Astros, which is interesting because it's like, in a lot of ways, you could argue where that's where he had his most success. He spends most of his coaching time talking about the Giants. So that's the era where he had Barry Bonds, Jeff Kent, Rich Aurelia. This was prior to them being super successful and winning their 3 World Series rings. So this wasn't like the Tim Lincecum, Barry Zito days. Like it was a little bit prior to that. But still, they were really successful. I mean, he ends up becoming the 7th most wins of all managers. I think when he retired, I want to say he was 5th most. So anyway, interesting in that sense. Another thing on the book is he doesn't go into a lot of detail about specific things in the clubhouse. He talks about that at the very end and how he feels like that's kind of private. But for me personally, I want to see that in a memoir. Like I want cool stories of players that you just can't get in the media, especially back then. And I'm not looking for salacious details. Like tell me about Barry Bonds and why that guy was so cool and what his dedication was and what his habits were and what made him different. And you don't have to go into the steroid stuff, but just tell me about Barry Bonds. Or, I mean, Hank Aaron stories. Tell me about his time with Bryce Harper, right? Or even some of these Astros guys, like some of the Astros players that are gonna Jose Altuve is potentially a Hall of Famer. You could argue that Alex Bregman is kind of on the way there. Yordan Alvarez at this pace might even be a Hall of Famer. Like, I just wish you would go into more detail about the players, their habits, the disciplines, what made them different. So overall, for me, a good book. You've got to be a fan of baseball to like it because it's heavy on baseball details. I think if you are, probably a must read because it's like a history book of the game of baseball. I mean, the guy was in the game of baseball for over 50 years in some of the biggest moments. So I enjoyed it. That's Crossroads by Dusty Baker, a memoir in baseball and life. Appreciate you watching. Thank you.